The heat was a physical weight, pressing down from a bleached white sky and rising from the baked, cracked earth in shimmering waves. It stole the breath from Alara's lungs and the moisture from her skin, leaving behind a fine grit of dust and despair. Thorns from the skeletal mesquite tore at the thin fabric of her dress, already shredded and stained with the story of her flight. Each rasp of the dry branches against her skin was a fresh terror, a sound that mimicked the scrape of a boot on stone, the guttural laugh of the men who had bartered for her life with a handful of silver coins. She had been running for 2 days, fueled by a terror so profound it had burned away hunger and thirst, leaving only the hollow ache of exhaustion. Now that fire was dwindling to embers. Her body was failing. She collapsed in the meager shade of a sandstone overhang, the rough rock a welcome, solid pain against her back. The world swam in a haze of heat and fear. To be caught was to be returned to a darkness worse than death. To perish here, in this godless expanse of rock and sun, felt like the only other path. A tear, hot and thick, traced a clean line through the grime on her cheek before the arid air stole it. This was the end. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic, hopeless pounding of her heart. Then, a new sound. The slow, deliberate crunch of hooves on gravel. Alara's blood ran cold. She flattened herself further against the rock, trying to will herself into the stone, to become invisible. She held her breath until her lungs screamed, listening. It was not the hurried, aggressive sound of pursuit. It was measured, weary, a lone horse moving at a walk. She risked a glance, peering through a thicket of brittle, gray-green brush. A man on a tall, dust-colored horse came into view. He was old, his face a roadmap of sun-etched lines, carved deep into weathered skin. A wide-brimmed hat cast his eyes in shadow, but his posture was straight, unbent by age or the oppressive heat. He stopped his horse not 20 yards from her hiding place, dismounting with a stiff but practiced grace. He was not one of them. The realization did not bring relief, only a different kind of fear. A stranger. In this land, a stranger was just a threat she did not yet know. He moved to his horse's side, pulling a canteen from a leather saddlebag. The slosh of water was the most beautiful and agonizing sound she had ever heard. He drank, then poured a little into his cupped hand for the horse, his movements economical and calm. His gaze swept the terrain, not with the predatory focus of a hunter, but with the patient observation of a man who knew the land, who read its silence like a book. Alara knew she should stay hidden, that survival depended on anonymity. But her body betrayed her. A shudder racked her frame, a tremor born of dehydration and terror, and a small stone skittered from beneath her foot. It was a tiny sound, yet in the profound stillness, it was as loud as a gunshot. The man's head snapped in her direction. His eyes, no longer in shadow, were a pale, startling blue. They were not cruel eyes, but they were hard, narrowed with a caution that mirrored her own. For a long moment he did not move. He simply watched her hiding place, his stillness more unnerving than any shout. The silence stretched, thin and tight. He knew she was there. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the canteen. He did not speak, did not beckon. He simply held it out, a silent offering in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Alara remained frozen, a rabbit caught in the gaze of a hawk. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs were lead. The men who had bought her had offered smiles before they had shown their fists. Kindness was a mask, a lure for a trap. Yet the man did not move closer. He simply stood there, patient, his arm outstretched. The sun beat down. The heat warped the air between them. Thirst was a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. It was the thirst that finally broke her will. With a soft, wretched sob, she pushed herself from the ground. She stumbled from the shadows of the rock and into the unforgiving sunlight, her hands held up slightly, a gesture of surrender. She was a ruin of a girl, with wild, sun-bleached hair and eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the present moment. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He did not lower the canteen until she was close enough to take it. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely grasp it. When she did, she drank with a desperate, choking urgency, water spilling down her chin and onto the tattered bodice of her dress. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on her face, taking in the bruised shadow on her jaw, the raw rope burns on her wrists. When she finally lowered the canteen, gasping for air, he spoke for the first time. His voice was like the land itself, dry and gravelly. "There's more at the ranch." It was not a question. It was not a command. It was a statement of fact, offered into the shimmering air between them. He turned and swung himself back onto his horse, then looked down at her. He waited. The choice, it seemed, was hers. Stay and die, or follow the stranger into an unknown future. With the taste of water still on her lips, a single drop of life in a desert of death, she took a halting step forward. The ranch was not a place of comfort, but of stark utility. A small, sturdy house built of sun-silvered timber and a solid barn stood against the backdrop of a vast, empty sky, dwarfed by the scale of the landscape. There were no frivolous touches, no flower beds or painted shutters. There was only what was necessary for survival. The man, whose name she learned was Silas, led her into the house. It was dim and cool inside, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and solitude. He gestured to a chair at a simple wooden table and filled a cup with water from a bucket, placing it before her. He moved with a quiet economy, never wasting a motion or a word. He cut a thick slice of bread and put it on a plate with a piece of cheese. Alara ate like a starving animal, not daring to look at him, her shame a hot flush on her face. He did not watch her. Instead, he stoked the embers in the hearth, his back to her, granting her a small, profound privacy. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from or why her wrists were raw. The silence was a balm, a space where she did not have to invent a story or relive the truth. That night, he gave her a small room at the back of the house. It contained only a narrow cot with a rough wool blanket and a small stand with a basin. But the door had a lock on the inside. As she slid the wooden bolt into place, a tremor of relief so deep it was painful shook her. For the first time in months, she was not chattel in a locked room. She was a person locking her own door. The days fell into a quiet, fragile rhythm. Silas never told her what to do, but work was the unspoken language of his home. She began by mending his shirts, her stitches small and neat, a skill her mother had taught her in another lifetime. She swept the floors. She learned to draw water from the deep well, the rhythmic creak of the pulley a steadying sound in the morning quiet. He would leave for the day, riding out to check his fences or his few dozen head of cattle, and she would feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest until she saw his familiar shape returning on the horizon at dusk. Trust was not a decision. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It grew in the spaces between words. It was in the way he left a bowl of fresh milk for her on the table each morning. It was in the way he silently laid a bar of soap and a clean, worn linen towel by the basin in her room. One afternoon, he came back from a trip to the distant town with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on the table without ceremony and left to tend his horse. Inside, Alara found a simple dress of dark blue cotton and a pair of sturdy leather boots. They were not new, but they were whole and clean. She ran her hand over the smooth fabric, a stark contrast to the ragged garment she had worn for weeks. She burned her old dress in the hearth that night, watching the flames consume the last physical reminder of her bondage. When she appeared the next morning in the blue dress, Silas merely nodded, his gaze lingering for a second before he turned to pour his coffee. But in that fleeting glance, she saw something other than hardness, a flicker of something that might have been approval, or perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement of the person emerging from the ruin. She began to find her footing, not just in the sturdy boots, but on the solid ground of this lonely patch of earth. She started a small garden in a protected patch of soil near the house, coaxing stubborn life from the dry ground. The small, green shoots were a promise, a testament to resilience. Her resilience. Weeks bled into months. The raw fear that had lived in Alara's bones began to recede, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, then a tentative strength. The vast, empty landscape that had once seemed a canvas for her death now felt like a shield. Its sheer scale offered anonymity, a place to disappear and be reborn. She learned the ranch not as a prisoner, but as a student. She learned the difference between the call of a hawk and the cry of a buzzard. She learned the smell of rain on the air hours before the clouds gathered. She saw how Silas moved with the land, not against it, respecting its power and its unforgiving nature. Her voice, once trapped in her throat, began to find its way out. Started small. "The gray mare has a stone in her shoe," she said one evening, her voice rough from disuse. Silas stopped, looked at her, then went to check. He returned later and simply said, "You have good eyes." The simple praise landed in her chest with the weight of a treasure. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, of her contribution. She was no longer just a mouth to feed, a refugee he had taken in out of pity. She was useful. She was observant. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent, terrifying spectacle of lightning and wind that rattled the small house to its foundations. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rain came down in solid sheets. Alara sat by the hearth, the fire the only point of warmth and light in the roaring dark. She found herself trembling, the storm outside echoing a deeper tempest within her. Silas sat opposite her, cleaning a piece of tack, his hands steady and methodical. He seemed unbothered by the chaos. He looked up, his pale eyes catching the firelight. "My wife, she hated storms," he said, his voice low, nearly lost in the gale. Said it sounded like the world was coming apart. It was the most he had ever offered about his past. Alara stared at him, seeing for the first time not just an old, hard rancher, but a man who had also known loss, who understood the shape of loneliness. "My mother loved them," she found herself replying, the words surprising her. She said it was the earth washing itself clean. Silas held her gaze for a long moment, and in that shared look, a new, deeper understanding passed between them. The barrier of their mutual caution had finally, irrevocably been breached. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely harbor in one another. The world outside could rage, but inside this small, sturdy house, they had built a quiet peace. The storm eventually passed, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. Alara stepped outside the next morning into a world renewed. The sun glinted off damp leaves. The dust was settled. She breathed in deeply, and for the first time since she had been stolen from her life, the air felt entirely her own. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to live. The peace was shattered on a blistering afternoon in late summer. Alara was weeding her garden, the sun hot on her back, when she heard the sound she had been subconsciously dreading for months. The sound of multiple horses approaching, too fast, too confident. Her head snapped up. 3 riders were cresting the low rise that marked the edge of Silas's property. Even at a distance, their swagger was unmistakable. One of them wore a gaudy red shirt, a searing slash of color against the muted landscape. It was him, Carver, the man who had bought her, whose face was a nightmare etched into her memory. Ice flooded her veins. Her first instinct was primal, a scream of pure terror clawing its way up her throat. Hide, run, disappear. She scrambled backward, stumbling, her breath catching in ragged sobs. Silas emerged from the barn, a piece of harness in his hand. He saw the riders, then he saw her face, stark white with terror. His expression hardened into granite. He dropped the harness and moved to stand between her and the approaching men, his body a frail but unyielding wall. "Go inside, girl," he said, his voice low and steady, though she could see the corded muscles in his neck standing out. "Lock the door." But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her gaze locked on the approaching evil. Carver reined in his horse a dozen yards from the house, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across his face as his eyes fell on her. Well, well, look what the old coyote dragged in," he drawled, his voice slick with menace. "Been looking for you, pet." You owe me for the trouble." The other two men laughed, their eyes roaming over her with a possessive filth that made her skin crawl. Silas stood his ground. "She owes you nothing," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is my land. You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride out." Carver spat on the ground. "She's my property. I paid good silver for her. I'll be taking her back, old man." "Try and stop me." He began to dismount, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. In that instant, something inside Alara broke. It was not her spirit, but the cage of fear that had imprisoned it. She saw Silas, old and alone, standing ready to die for her. She saw the garden she had cultivated, the clean blue dress she wore, the life she had painstakingly pieced back together from ash. And a white-hot rage, pure and cleansing, burned away the last vestiges of the terrified girl she had been. She would not hide. She would not be taken. Not again. While the men's attention was on Silas, she turned and ran, not away, but into the barn. Her hands, no longer trembling, found the cold, heavy stock of the rifle Silas kept propped by the door. He had shown her how to load and fire it, teaching her to shoot at tin cans on a fence post. "A woman alone needs to know," he had said gruffly. Now she understood. Her fingers moved with a surety she didn't know she possessed, sliding a cartridge into the chamber. She stepped back into the blinding sunlight, the rifle heavy and solid in her hands. She raised it to her shoulder, the wooden stock firm against her cheek, and sighted down the long barrel, just as he had taught her. The world narrowed to the man in the red shirt. He had frozen, halfway off his horse, his eyes wide with disbelief. The sneer was gone, replaced by shock. "Get off his land," Alara said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and cold as a winter river. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air was thick with tension. Then Carver's hand twitched, a fatal mistake. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, its roar echoing across the silent canyon. The shot was not aimed at him, but at the ground a foot from his boot, kicking up a violent spray of dust and rock. The other men's horses shied, spooked by the blast. Carver flinched back as if struck. He stared at Alara, at the unwavering barrel of the rifle pointed at his chest, at the chilling resolve in her eyes. He saw not the broken slave he had lost, but a woman he did not know, a woman who would not hesitate to fire again. Without another word, he scrambled back onto his horse, yanked the reins, and spurred the animal into a panicked retreat, his companions close behind. Alara stood watching until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. She slowly lowered the rifle, her arms shaking now, the adrenaline draining away. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Silas turned to her, his face a mask of awe and relief. He walked over and gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked not at the weapon, but at her face. He saw the strength there, the fire that had been forged in the crucible of her past and tempered in the quiet solitude of his home. He had not saved her. He had simply given her the time and space to save herself. A slow, rare smile touched the corners of his weathered mouth. "The earth," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. Washing itself clean, Alara looked out at the vast, sun-drenched land. It was no longer a place of exile, but a kingdom she had claimed. It was her sanctuary, her fortress, her home. And standing beside this quiet, steadfast man, she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was no longer alone.